Good morning, everybody. The webinar will begin very, very shortly. We'll just wait a few moments for everybody to join the call. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this morning. This is the fourth in our series on how Whitehall works, and we're going to be looking today at how Labour is changing the way government works to focus on mission delivery. So in terms of that topic, following the general election, Labour has formed a government with a large majority and with a focus on delivering 5 national missions. And Keir Starmer has said that focusing on these missions will require a different approach to government, so requiring less working in traditional silos, new partnerships between the private and the public sector, for example, better relationships between national and local governments. And in our conversations today, we're going to be covering the following areas. So what is a mission-led government? How is government being structured to deliver the missions? What did the budget indicate for delivery of the missions? How is Labour going to be held accountable for delivering on these missions? What other changes have we seen or haven't we seen since the election? And then we'll also, because I know a lot of you will be interested in this, we'll be talking about how Global Government Forum could help you and your organisation engage with a mission-focused Labour government. We have 2 fantastic speakers with us here today. I'm going to introduce our speakers and then ask them a couple of questions to get the conversation going. But we really do want this to be a discussion with you, our audience. This is your opportunity to ask any questions that you've got about the new government and how it is focusing on these missions. So the device you're using should have a Q&A button on it. At any point, please don't wait till the end. At any point from now on, use that Q&A function to message in your questions or your comments and join in the conversation. We want to really make it feel like a two-way discussion. So the speakers that we have with us today, we've got Patrick Diamond, who is Professor in Public Policy at the Queen Mary University of London. But Patrick held a number of senior posts in the British central government between 2000 and 2010, including he was head of the policy planning in number 10 Downing Street. Patrick's got a wealth of experience across lots of different areas. So he was a local councillor in the London Borough of Southwark from 2010 to 2014. He's been a trustee of the Bromley by Bow Centre, which is a voluntary organisation led by the local community in East London. He's also on the board of the Campaign for Social Science and a trustee of the Dartington Service Design Lab and the Prisoners Education Trust. He's chair of the think tank Policy Network, and he's a regular contributor to national newspapers, radio and TV programmes, and also works with GGF on some of our training. So it's fantastic to have you with us here today, Patrick. And then a familiar face to some of you, I think, who may be joining us today, we've got Richard Johnston, who is executive editor here at Global Government Forum. He produces all of the editorial analysis and insight for our audience of public servants around the world. And before joining GGF, Richard spent nearly 5 years at the UK-based title Civil Service World, latterly as acting editor, and has worked in public policy journalism throughout his career. So as I say, please do take this opportunity to make this a conversation and message in your questions, and I'll keep coming to those throughout our conversation. But Richard, I think I'm going to kick off first with the very obvious question of what exactly is mission-led government? And apart from Labour here in the UK, who else is doing it?
Thanks, Siobhan, and hello, everyone. Good morning. So mission-led government is the idea that you can set bold, overarching priorities for the work of government that can help join up the different arms of the state across traditional boundaries, as you mentioned. That, I think, is one of the main kind of attractions of this approach, is that it can help break down silos that a lot of politicians, I think, feel frustrated about bouncing up against in government. The genesis of it in its current usage, I think, is kind of primarily inspired by the Apollo program to put a man on the moon. President John F. Kennedy's famous quote about the United States committing itself to achieve the goal of putting a man on the moon before the 1960s were out. He made that pledge in 1961. And that was a kind of totemic example of a government leader setting a priority around which the work of government would coalesce and from which a series of benefits would follow. That's why you sometimes hear this sort of mission approach being referred to as a moonshot. That it's that's another word that appears in the kind of phraseology. But it's that kind of creating unifying goals to help overcome obstacles that can traditionally hinder government working. And then in its kind of modern iteration, I think it became known through the work of Mariana Mazzucato, an economist and academic, a name that might be familiar to some people watching along, who has examined the potential of kind of mission-oriented approaches in her books, most notably Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide, which kind of mirrors that language I was talking about. So it is an approach that governments around the world have adopted, but sometimes I think that we're talking about two things. I want to kind of delineate them a little bit. Um, so there's one approach which is to set kind of grand missions, which is what the UK has, big overarching challenges, akin to those moonshots. So the UK has, and we saw it on the previous slide, set 5 missions to secure high sustained growth in the G7, make Britain a green energy superpower, take back the streets by halving serious violent crime, break down barriers to opportunity, and build an NHS fit for the future. So those are the kind of grand missions. We did a podcast with a academic called Dan Honig earlier this year, who's the author of a book called Mission Driven Bureaucrats. And in the book and in our conversation, Dan separates out these grand missions from kind of what he calls kind of organizational missions. You know, that the mission of a fire department is to put out fires. Those are slightly more prosaic. Perhaps in the UK, we'd call those kind of organizational purpose. But in governments like the US, that kind of mission statement, for want of a better word, is a lot of how they conceive of missions. Each kind of government department in the United States has an overarching objective that they will define as their mission. So there is, I think we talk about missions, and this conversation today will be those kind of grand missions about breaking down silos of the state and setting, hopefully, kind of stretch objectives. But when people talk about missions, they also do sometimes mean the kind of singular objective of a department or agency that kind of is to try and keep a focus on the top priority.
Okay, so when it comes to these big grand missions, I mean, one of the things that always comes up in the work we do is how difficult it is for government to kind of work across departments. So I imagine there's quite a lot of kind of rewiring that's going to have to take place. So how is Labour approaching that in order to deliver these big missions?
Yeah, there's some things we know and some things that we don't quite know yet, and I think that the institutions are still kind of responding to this way of thinking, and I think that's a very interesting thing to monitor and something we'll get into in this conversation. But in his first one of his first announcements as Prime Minister, Keir Starmer announced the creation of mission boards that he would chair as Prime Minister to bring together the work of the different parts of government that would be needed to achieve these missions. Then kind of beneath that, and this isn't quite a hierarchy because there's different elements to it, but beneath that, then there is a lead department for each mission that has kind of central responsibility for that policy area. And then there is a mission delivery unit that has been established in the Cabinet Office with the aim to remove any barriers to progress. So we know that that mission delivery unit in the Cabinet Office has a head, Clara Swinson, who was previously Director General of Global Health at the Department for Health and Social Care, has been appointed to head that unit at a second permanent secretary grade. She's working closely with Pat McFadden, who is the kind of politician, minister within government with the kind of day-to-day responsibility for overseeing mission deliveries. The mission control, which again gets back to that space age an analogy, is going to be based in 70 Whitehall in the Cabinet Office. And for people interested in such things, that is also where Dominic Cummings planned to base his mission control. I don't think it ever quite came to fruition, but it just shows you this is kind of a long-standing aim to overcome a lot of these barriers. There was some reporting in the Times that the mission control will be given a specific mandate to do what we're talking about here, to break down silos in government, and not just between organisations, but between policy and delivery, to kind of better join up the creation of policy with its delivery. And there will also be an emphasis on kind of real-time data metrics to better track implementation. And then each mission will have, and again, this lingo does very much lead to one thinking in NASA terms, we'll have a mission controller, a senior civil servant in the kind of responsible lead department, who's kind of most responsible for the sort of day-to-day work, I think. As far as I can tell, there's been one mission controller publicly confirmed in place, who is a gentleman called Chris Stark. He used to be the chief executive of the Climate Change Committee, and he has been appointed to lead the control centre tasked with delivering the Clean Power mission. Also then looking on LinkedIn, I was able to find a number of other people who'd been appointed to that kind of mission control for the Clean Power mission. That seems to be staffing up the fastest. Obviously, a check of job titles on LinkedIn isn't a foolproof way to get these to work out who is where, but there was more people under that mission than any other one. So that seems to be where there's kind of most immediate progress, but that's something I think we'll be obviously keeping an eye on. And kind of as we begin to think towards implementation, I also just want to flag that Sir Michael Barber has returned to government to provide advice to the Prime Minister and to presumably Pat McFadden and that central unit on kind of mission delivery, including advice on kind of coordinating the objectives for each mission. An interesting thing I think to note is Barber worked under the previous government to create what was called a public value framework. Quite a lot of work went into this in government to help better measure what government organisations do and the outcomes of those as opposed to the outputs, and better understanding the key levers of government. That's a really interesting approach. It never quite got fully implemented. It was piloted in a few departments, but that chimes very nicely, I think, with a kind of mission, an approach to missions, that kind of using public value to monitor the key elements of progress. So that might be an approach that develops. I'm just flagging that because it's an area that I know Michael put a lot of work into. Yeah, I think that could be a frame through which this is then developed further.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. So a lot of things already happening, obviously, there, and you've set out the mission boards and everything. Patrick, I'm going to come to you because you sat at the heart of government. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you, do you think we're seeing the changes that you would expect? Kind of what are we seeing in Whitehall? But we've had a couple of questions come in already. So I just want to go to one of those from Ed Duval, who's come in. Why is our government only just starting to use missions if they've been successful in other countries? So, any thoughts, Patrick, on why we're doing this now? Why has Labour come in this time with a mission-led approach, do you think?
Well, good morning, Siobhan, and it's great to be with you and great to be with everybody on the call. And thank you for inviting me to this Global Government Forum event, which I think does address really important questions about the extent to which the UK government is going to be able to migrate towards this kind of mission-led approach to governance, which Richard has very eloquently set out. I think to come directly to the question about why now, there's perhaps two reasons that are just worth citing. I think the first is that this is a government which has come to power with a very ambitious domestic policy agenda. That partly reflects the nature of its electoral mandate. So, as people will remember from the election, Labour was elected, I think, because of two particular commitments it made. One was to more sustainably grow the UK economy so as to improve living standards and to address the cost of living crisis. And the other was to, of course, introduce serious improvements into the performance of the NHS, which has really suffered in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And so Labour, I think, believed that in these circumstances, in order to achieve this very challenging domestic policy agenda, in circumstances in which economically there is not much room for manoeuvre, and we saw in the budget the fiscal constraints the government faces, that there has to be a new way of doing government. And the new way of doing government, the new approach, the new focus on accountability, the new focus on performance is really summed up by this mission-led approach. So I think one reason is about the circumstances in which the new government finds itself, its commitment to domestic reform, but also its desire to get government working differently. And then I think, secondly, it is part of what is an increasingly international conversation about government reform and the extent to which countries are learning from each other. Now, as you mentioned earlier on, Siobhan, I did work under both the Blair and Brown governments. And I think at that point, there was the beginnings of more learning going on where different countries were trying to better address how they could restructure and improve their own system of government by learning from international experience. The truth is that then, though, we were still very, I think, parochial and quite internally focused, and in some ways still very reluctant to learn from other countries. But I think what you see with this mission-led approach is a genuine desire to try to draw on the best experience from what other governments have done around the world. I think the mission-based approach is one of the best ways of crystallizing that. I think, as we'll maybe discuss later on in the session, this does, though, raise some tensions as to how you can reconcile the mission-led approach with some of the more traditional features of how Whitehall works. And Richard alluded to some of that in terms of the accountability question. How do you get departments to really work together effectively? How do you get better relations between ministers and civil servants? But those might be questions we return to a bit later.
Yeah. Well, that kind of touches on the question I was going to ask you as the first kind of question from me is, do you think we're seeing those structural changes in Whitehall that you would expect? Are we seeing the changes that you would assume would be put in place now to have the foundations of this mission-led approach? Or are there things not happening that you would expect to have happened by now?
Well, I don't think there have been any dramatic changes in the machinery of government. Now, whether you would expect that to happen, I think in some ways the mission-led approach can be made compatible with many of the traditional ways in which Whitehall works. But I think the new government, as it's come into power, has been really concerned with two things. One is improving the relationship between ministers and civil servants. And secondly, making the centre of government better able to assert the grip of the Prime Minister and to drive performance across the machinery of government. So on the civil service minister side, I mean, I don't need to tell you, Siobhan, that I think there was a feeling that under the previous Conservative administrations, relations between civil servants and ministers had reached a new low. In the sense that there was a lot of conflict, a lot of disagreement. I think a feeling from civil servants that they were being attacked in public and that there was a real cultural disconnect between where the ministers were and where civil servants were. So I think Labour's come in with a desire to reset that relationship and to try to get relations between ministers and civil servants onto a much more constructive footing. I think the other area, and again, Richard touched on this, is trying to make the centre of government again more powerful by building up the capacities, capabilities of the Cabinet Office. And that's partly about creating new structures. So you have the mission delivery boards overseen by Clara Swinson, as we heard. You also have a powerful politician in Pat McFadden working with also Georgia Gould, who of course is the former leader of Camden Council, really driving the political focus of the centre through the Cabinet Office. Now, I don't think those changes are any major deviation from how Whitehall has traditionally worked, but I think they are seen as necessary to get mission-led government operating effectively. I mean, you can have all of the mission-led structures that you want. You can have ambitious targets. You can have these really grand ambitions. But if you don't have civil servants and ministers working well together on policy, and you don't have a strong centre which can coordinate and bring all of the elements together, then making mission-led government work is going to be very difficult. So I really see Labour's focus in the first few months as getting those basic structures in place and working well. And I would expect to see over the next 12 to 18 months, perhaps, some more ambitious changes in terms of how the structures of government across Whitehall are working, but also crucially, not just Whitehall, but how Whitehall is interfacing with the devolved governments, with the new city region mayors across England, and also with civil society and private sector organisations.
Great. So getting the centre kind of where they want it to be, and then you would expect from now on to see some of those other changes coming down the line. I mean, there has been a bit of turbulence in the centre, hasn't there? So maybe they had to get through that, and now there's going to be this period of stability maybe in the centre now.
That is indeed true. And the transition from opposition into government is always difficult. I think there's been a lot of criticism of the Starmer government for perhaps not being as well prepared as it should have been and could have been. But it is worth remembering, I certainly recall from the 1997 period that when the new government came in, there were quite a few teething problems because I think ministers have to get used to working within government structures, getting politicians comfortable with operating with civil servants can be challenging. And so it's inevitable that you will face some of these difficulties. But I think there is no doubt, it is no doubt the case that the departure of Sue Gray did indicate that there was some instability at the centre of government. And I think the efforts over the last few months have really been on trying to, stabilise the position, get the centre of government into a more functional position, and from there on, to really hopefully get this mission-led approach to be much more embedded across the whole of the Whitehall system and beyond, as I mentioned, within other parts of the UK and devolved governments.
Thanks, Patrick. We do have another question from Ed. It's specifically about the NHS, but that might be answered, Ed, over the next few questions that I'm going to ask Richard and Patrick. But if not, we'll definitely come back to that and check in whether we've answered it for you. But Richard, I want to move on to, because this might link to Ed's question, is we recently had the budget. So what were the key announcements in the budget in terms of kind of what would you expect that they are kind of setting the context for these missions and beyond? Did we see what you were expecting to see in the budget?
Great, thanks, Siobhan. I will, I think, touch on a response to that question in this answer. So there was quite a lot in the budget in terms of fiscal measures, setting spending plans for the years ahead, but not a huge amount of kind of forward-looking stuff yet. And indeed, there was briefing that, and I feel this is a cliche that governments always say, that they were wanting to use the budget get back to budgets as fiscal events rather than grand policy unveilings, which I think is one of those things chancellors try to stick to and don't always manage it. But in the budget, Rachel Reeves set the budgets for the remainder of the current financial year, which she says had to change to account for unfunded spending commitments that she inherited, and then setting departmental budgets for the next financial year. And then the next kind of step of the process is that a full spending review, what the government is calling a phase 2 spending review, that will set departmental spending allocations for the following financial year. And that is going to be, according to the government, a mission-led, technology-enabled and reform-driven settlement for public services So that spending review for those allocations that will kick in a couple of years will conclude in spring 2025. So giving departments then a full year to get ready for it. And it will be interesting to see how that process is run. I think we'll touch on that in a minute. In the budget that was announced last month, there was an increase in public spending, 4.3% real terms per year on average for this year and next year, and there was tax rises that were kind of intended to pay for that. But then public spending increases aren't quite as generous for the period when the kind of spending review phase 2 will take account. And that, I think, gets to an interesting potential tension here, in that the government has committed to the missions, but it also committed to what it called first steps, which were meant to be a lot more kind of retail politics, things that they could sell on the doorsteps to voters. Those two things needn't necessarily be in tension, but to get to the point about what is the question that was asked about what is the government really planning to do differently from previous governments from Ed. You can imagine a situation where you're getting the NHS fit for the future requires an awful lot of preventative spending and a much more early intervention as health service. Now, you can get to that following the kind of investments that the government is making now up front in intending to cut waiting lists and things like that. But that's not where they're putting the money when they have it. They're putting the money when they have it in, I'm sure as they would see it, kind of repairing the situation as it was. It could well be that the kind of stabilizing the situation sets the platform on which the missions can be built, but there's no immediate link between some of the spending announcements that were made at the budget and the mission approach. And it will be really interesting to see how that spending review kind of matches up the first steps and the missions.
So in terms of that spending review, again, what's going to be different? How will a government run a mission-led spending review, do you think?
Really interesting question. And I think we're going to kind of primarily keep an eye out to see. The announcements that they have made are that departments will be required to work together to provide kind of shared strategies for delivering missions, and that that will be kind of the basis for their bids into the Treasury. I will be watching that very closely because I am slightly cynical on this. I think that is the key to making the missions work. If the money doesn't follow the missions, then they will run into the same problem that the last government had, which I don't know if people remember. The last government's approach to levelling up used this missions phraseology. There were missions linked to levelling up. But the first kind of signs that the cynics highlighted that levelling up might not succeed was that the Treasury's allocations didn't follow the missions. The Treasury's allocations followed local authority bids, rather than emphasising how to join up the things that needed to join up to achieve the levelling up aims. So that I think is really where the rubber hits the road, and there's not obvious signs of it in what was announced in the budget. And I definitely think it is conceivable to run a spending review along mission lines, but as we've touched on, there's a lot of inertia in government. Sometimes people are used to doing things the way they've always been done, and it will require a lot of work to develop the systems, the bids, the processes to run things differently.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Patrick, again, we've got other questions coming in. So I'm going to ask you in a minute about how Labour are going to be held accountable for delivering on these missions. But I think linking to what Richard has said there about the spending review and what's going to be different, Louise Barker has asked, what role will local government have to play in delivering the missions? Now, you yourself have been involved in local government as well as central government. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And it has to be said that it comes at a time when the new government has been talking a lot about the importance of devolution. It was striking that in the first few days of becoming Prime Minister, Keir Starmer had met all of the city region mayors across England. And the general mood, the general tenor of the message from Number 10 has been that local councils and local government are a very important part of the government story. And I think there's some reasons to take that seriously, not least because Morgan McSweeney, who was, of course, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, himself comes from a background working in local government. So he was for a while an official in Lambeth Council and then worked for the Local Government Association. So I think that is a potentially important relationship at the centre of government. Which could serve to give local government a voice that perhaps it hasn't, well, it certainly hasn't had in central government over recent decades. I think to come directly to Louisa's question, local government will have a key role to play in the delivery of all of the missions, not least as an implementation partner and as a key driver of delivery. I think there are some missions where local government's role is perhaps more obvious than others. So two that I would just pull out as being particularly important are the economic growth mission and the climate mission. And I mentioned both of those because on the economic side, all of the evidence is that while national growth is an important goal and objective to seek to achieve, a lot of the potential to grow regional and local economies can only come through local government and devolved government action. And we know that in more decentralized governments, there tends to be less regional economic inequality. So I think local government's role in driving investment, in improving infrastructure, in getting businesses to invest in local areas will be of pivotal importance. And I think on the climate agenda, while we tend to think of climate obviously as very much a global issue, it is again important to remember that a lot of the changes we need to make in terms of creating a more resilient infrastructure, making the investments we need to make our communities greener and more sustainable, will again come through the local level, through investment in retrofit and in improving housing, improving insulation, all of the practical things that we need to do, where again, I think local government has a huge role to play. The one final point I would just mention quickly, Siobhan, is that, of course, local government needs to have the capacity to be able to do those things. And again, we know that in the last 15 years, local government has been squeezed financially. There's been a loss, I think, of capacity in terms of personnel and functions. And so if central government, if the Starmer government really wants local government to be part of the story in making mission-led government a reality, then one of the other building blocks it will need to put in place early on is really investing in and improving the capacity of local government to be an effective actor.
Which again comes back to watching the spending review process, I think, going forward.
Which is you make a crucial point because, of course, as Richard was saying, in terms of the spending review, it's worth mentioning that although the budget has delivered significant new money for the National Health Service, actually for most departments, the position will be very tight in the next spending review, including local government. So I think the centre's going to have to think very hard about what can it do to improve the financial position of local authorities. I mean, myself, if I'm just putting ideas out there, I think we do need serious reform of council tax to try and get local authority funding into a better position. But that's probably a topic for another seminar.
Another webinar we'll do.
Exactly.
So Patrick,
local government nettles, can I just say quickly, you are hearing noises from government that is slightly concerned about who their counterparties are in local government to deliver a lot of these missions. If you look at English local government, you know, some areas are two-tier, some are one-tier, some areas have combined authorities, some of them don't. And I think there's a realization in government that unevenness, long-standing problem though it is something that could hinder mission delivery. And I wonder if there's a willingness to kind of finally tackle that and create a bit more uniformity that then allows kind of the devolution to happen everywhere rather than just in some places.
We've got other questions coming in. So I do want to move on to, because I'm going to come to Simon's question after I've asked you about accountability, Patrick, because I think it might link to what Simon's asking and back to what Ed was asking about how can we make sure this time it's really different. So I think what I wanted to hear from you, Patrick, is how how do you think the government is going to be held accountable? Because it's all very well saying they want to do all of these things, but as we know, lots of governments say they're going to do things. But how are they going to be held accountable for delivery of these missions?
So I think it's important to say that the way that the missions are framed is, in a sense, partly with an eye to the electoral dimension. They're not quite the pledges that we saw in the New Labour style Blair 1997 pledge card, but they are designed to be framed in a way that would be understandable, I think, and resonant with voters. So I think the ultimate accountability will come through the electoral system and whether Labour is re-elected in 4 years' time on the basis that it has delivered the substantive missions that it set out in its 2024 manifesto. I do think that the accountability question, though, also reveals some of the tensions around the mission-led government approach and how it fits with how our system of government in Whitehall has traditionally functioned. And I would just very quickly raise 2 points here. I think the first is that if you look at the philosophy of mission-led government, then obviously part of the approach is about central government relinquishing some of the power and control that it's traditionally exercised. You know, if you look at the rhetoric, the strategy of mission-led government, a lot of it is about trying to address long-standing public policy problems by giving more power and control to frontline delivery organisations that are closer to citizens and therefore have a better understanding of the problems that they're encountering on a daily basis. Now, again, I don't need to tell you, Siobhan, that that is a major culture shift for Whitehall, because civil servants generally have tended to operate for most of their careers within central government departments. The understanding of how the wider public sector functions is not necessarily that great. I think there's also an understandable cultural sense that, you know, departments have to maintain control because ultimately they will be held accountable to Parliament, how public money is spent and how well services are functioning. So I think there's a tension there about Whitehall's cultural approach. I think quickly there's also a tension around accountability in terms of whether dispersed accountability is realistic in the Whitehall context. So again, a lot of the mission-led approach is about having a more collaborative style of leadership. It's about sharing responsibility for missions across a broader range of different secretaries of state and departments. But the question I would pose is, how realistic is that? So to take the health example very quickly, Wes Streeting, who is Secretary of State for Health, as we all know, is going to no doubt engage in the mission-led approach, but ultimately he is going to feel very personally and politically responsible for driving improvements in the NHS. And so I don't think you can get away from the reality that ministerial and departmental accountability is very much hardwired into our system of government. And however good mission-led government is at setting these broader priorities and trying to have a broader sense of accountability, you can't get away from the fact that that is how Whitehall has traditionally functioned. And I don't see any evidence that the Starmer government really wants to revisit that.
Right. So the question from Simon, I'm going to put this to you, Patrick, and then to Richard. And I know we're going to move on in a minute to kind of opportunities for private sector working with the new government. But Simon's question specifically is, as a key supplier to all parts of the panorama of public service, so I'm assuming central and local government, what advice would you offer to build up confidence on both sides? And I think this does link to Ed's question, I think. So what is going to be different? How can you give people confidence that this time it's going to be different?
Well, yes, I think that on the question of how ministers work with the private sector, it is worth saying that the Starmer government takes a different view to the approach that the Blair and Brown governments took in the 1990s and 2000s. I think in those governments, there was a general confidence, a belief that the private sector was a very important player in the process of improving public services. And there was a real commitment to leveraging the expertise, the financial firepower, the knowledge and the practical skills that were located in the private sector. Under the Starmer government, I don't think that has disappeared, but in reality, there is perhaps more skepticism about the role that the private sector has traditionally played. I think that the COVID pandemic perhaps revealed some of the weaknesses around procurement and outsourcing. I think there's also a nervousness among some Labour politicians that there was too much reliance on a few very large companies to procure services from in the private sector. So the new government has come in with a desire to make some changes. But although I think there are risks for the private sector, I do think there are also serious opportunities. I think one is that the Labour government knows that in order to demonstrate progress to voters, it will have to work closely with the private sector. Three areas I would very quickly mention would be the importance, of course, of working with the private sector in the NHS. I think also delivering major transport, rail projects, as well as the commitments around housing. If this government's going to build 1.5 million new homes in this parliament, then it's going to have to work very closely with the private sector. And I also think the agenda of making government work more efficiently, applying new technologies, increasing the scope for cost savings will also require the public and private sector to work together. Just to come directly to Simon's question, I think that there are also, though, some important ways of building confidence across both sectors. So I think it's very important for government to show that it can be a reliable partner and that there are not going to be rapid changes either in regulation or contracting arrangements, or indeed also in tax arrangements that might affect the ability of private sector businesses to operate in the public sector. So I think we need stability, and the public sector and government need to provide that. But I think also on the private sector side, they do need to build confidence. They need to show that they've got value for money propositions that can really help public services to get better. Another point that I would just quickly emphasize is the importance of the private sector showing its commitment to delivering objectives around both environmental improvements and also social and employment regulation improvements. So this government is very committed to improving relations with the workforce generally. And I think around procurement, they will want to see the private sector meeting its obligations in terms of ensuring that there is an improvement in employment rights across the board. So I think the private sector can demonstrate and build confidence in its own ability to contribute to what the government wants to do by really showing that it's committed to those agendas.
Thanks. And Richard, you were saying before we went live, I think, is the government about to or just has issued some new guidance on procurement? And I think we in GGF will be doing a whole webinar on this in March next year, if I'm correct on that one.
Indeed, what they're currently developing the National Procurement Policy Statement that is going to be produced early next year, I think March time, that is about kind of linking the reforms in the Procurement Act that were that was passed last year with the missions approach. The new planning procurement policy statement is intended to kind of support the delivery of the missions. So there's going to be a lot of work, I imagine, going into that, and that will be, yeah, the plan policy statement will be completed in February, according to government. I don't know when it will be published, but shortly after that, because then the provisions of the Act will take effect the same month. So that's one way.
We just shared the details of a webinar with everybody, so if you want to sign up for that, please do.
Yeah, as that
really
statement
yeah.
is published, we are going to analyze it and share insight with this audience. I think the point that Patrick makes about stability is a very good one. Obviously, it was one of the Keir Starmer's main contentions in the election campaign, was that stability could unlock a lot of economic benefits and wider societal benefits just by existing, which we hadn't had in recent years. And even before the kind of tumult of the Brexit campaign, I'm just thinking back, the government published its industrial strategy at the end of last month. We are not a nation that is short of industrial strategies in the last 2 decades. They never seem to last much longer than the fruit in your fruit bowl. And if these can be established, and that people, to get to Simon's word, can trust that the government means what it says in the industrial strategy, and that it is consistently implemented, and that's all the hard yards. But I think there is a lot of benefit to come from the consistent implementation of what government says it will do, not constantly chopping and changing, and that will help build that trust.
Thanks. I do want to move on to kind of the area of digital and data and tech and the changes we've already seen there, and whether that's going to support the missions. But two questions that have come in immediately on this issue of kind of maybe procurement, social value, and the mission. So Sarah has asked, how do policy outcomes of social value get aligned to the missions, particularly the mission for economic growth? And Simon has come back with a follow-up question to you, Patrick, saying, well, how does government incentivize suppliers of all sizes to buy into the missions, other than the societal need to support government? What role do you see social value playing in ensuring industry is aligned to the government missions? So quite quickly, because I think we will be doing a lot more events specifically on these areas, but any advice back to Sarah and Simon on this issue of social value and incentivizing the private sector?
Well, I think these are, again, brilliant questions, and as you said before, they probably deserve a session really focusing on the question of how the government will regard and approach social value. I think you'd have to break it down and obviously look across each of the 5 missions and just analyse where there is perhaps the greatest opportunity to apply a social value approach. I think, for example, on the economic mission, and Sarah mentions this in her question, there is clearly a lot of opportunity to think about how you could link together policy outcomes with social value with this broader mission for economic growth, because although economic growth requires us to deliver improvements in productivity, which partly relies on things like improving the level of private sector investment and also improving physical and social infrastructure, there is a social value dimension to this, which is also hugely important. And I mentioned that the government is very much committed to reducing regional inequalities in our economy, which of course is one of the most regionally unequal in the world. And I think it's important to just note that although the headline commitment is to make the UK the best growing economy in the G7, I think the government is committed not just to higher growth, but also to a better quality of growth. And by quality, I mean both more environmentally sustainable economic growth, but also growth which is more widely shared across the population and also across different geographical areas. So I think the social value dimensions there are very obvious in terms of what could be built upon. But as I say, I think you would want to look across each of the missions and consider how that should best be done. To come to Simon's question very quickly, I know you want to move on, Siobhan, but I would just say that I think the government is thinking about how it can more strongly incentivize private sector partners to work with it on some of these big missions. And I just wanted to mention quickly, people may be aware that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is making a speech this evening at the Mansion House in which she's going to talk about pension funds and the way in which we might reform our pension funds to create bigger pension funds that would therefore have greater firepower to invest in the development of British companies, British businesses, and also British infrastructure. And I think the use of pension funds is one obvious area where you could really think about government much more effectively incentivising the suppliers of public services and government services to improve the performance of government and delivery of the missions. But I do just want to say, and I'll finish on this, that although, as I mentioned earlier, in some ways perhaps the Starmer government has been a little bit more sceptical about the private sector role in the delivery of public services, I actually think that the public-private relationship will be more important for this government than it has been for the Blair and Brown government and indeed for recent Conservative governments. And the reason why I say that is because I think the UK faces major challenges in terms of renewing its economy, improving its public services, delivering innovation across how the public sector operates. It can only do those things by working in partnership with the private sector. I think Keir Starmer and his senior ministers understand that. And what is now going to be crucial is translating that, as Simon infers in his question, into a set of arrangements that can really incentivise the very best private sector involvement in delivering the government's public policy priorities.
Fabulous. Thanks, Patrick. Absolutely agree on the scale of the challenge can only be met if the sectors are working together. And on that note, Richard, one of the big areas where we know there has to be more collaboration and partnership working is in the area of technology and new technology. And I just wanted to ask you in particular, what changes have we seen since the election in terms of the way digital and data are being thought of at the centre of government? Because there have already been some machinery of government changes, haven't there?
Yeah, there have, and there have been quite significant machinery of government changes. It was a very early decision that the government made to move the 3 central digital agencies from the Cabinet Office to the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So that's the Government Digital Service, the Central Digital and Data Office, and the Incubator for AI were all moved to DCIT. That move is intended to create a new digital centre for government. And it was described by the Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, who was in that slide, talking to Christine Bellamy from GDS, to be part of transforming public services and fueling economic growth through science and technology. The government made quite a lot of progress early in the coalition years by setting up a kind of digital centre of government digital service, and was able to kind of make quite a lot of progress. I think there's kind of common consent that perhaps that has slowed slightly, and I think this is an effort to kind of re-energize that the kind of digital capabilities of government, and I think in Peter Kyle is a very energetic Secretary of State who is going to take these things on. We know that that digital centre of government in DCIT is focused on developing a strategy for artificial intelligence and harnessing the opportunities of that. And we did some research recently, Global Government Forum's Digital Leaders 2024 report, which was based on interviews with 10 digital leaders across the UK government on their perceptions on how ready government was for the use of AI, and that highlighted amongst its recommendations, and I do recommend giving it a read, find it on the Global Government Forum website, was the need for that overall strategy. So I think the creation of that kind of central capability is going to be vital to the delivery of the missions. A lot of them have elements in them that are about better use of technology. Getting the NHS fit for the future, for example, has a lot of focus on making the system in the NHS more effective. And we know from some of our work the frustrations that a lot of people in the NHS have about the technology that they have to grapple with on a day-to-day basis. So that is an area where I think that there's going to be a real focus on deploying technology, and yes, obviously it applies to the other missions as well.
And have they made any kind of key digital appointments that would be interesting for people to know about?
Well, there's been the creation of a panel of digital experts by DCIT to help the government make better use of technology across the public sector. So this group is kind of coming up with creating that vision for the digital centre of government, a 10-year vision to drive innovation, transform services, improve lives, and unlock the full potential of digital and data. That's co-chaired by the tech entrepreneur Baroness Martha Lane Fox, who I'm sure people will know from lastminute.com and other ventures, and the chair of the Central Digital and Data Office in government, Paul Wilmot. The other key appointment from a kind of missions perspective that we should probably mention, and is the upcoming appointment of the Cabinet Secretary. So unusual for the appointment of a Cabinet Secretary to have to wait 53 minutes into a webinar, but there we go. It is, of course, the most senior job in the UK civil service. And when it was announced that the competition had started, the job description for the new CabSec mentioned the kind of centrality of the mission-driven programme, and how the new CabSec will need to help deliver government's missions and pursue the necessary reforms to make government work better. So obviously that is a crucial appointment for a lot of different reasons, but it will be a crucial role as well in kind of catalysing the centre and really helping overcome the barriers that exist.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think that was all the questions I had for Richard and Patrick in terms of kind of setting the scene. And we've already had lots of questions in from people who are watching. I'm going to just now pause for a minute and just, I know for a lot of people who are watching, you might be thinking, well, how can we get involved with because we have quite a lot of suppliers, I think, who are in the audience today, people who work with government. So we're just going to run through a little bit of some of the opportunities that here in GGF we can help you with in terms of engaging with the new Labour government. But also, please do now send in any other questions that you had, because this is the last in our series of 4 webinars on kind of how Whitehall works. So any questions at all you've got about how you might work with government and what does the new government mean for you, and whether it's mission based or not, then please do send those questions in now, and Richard and Patrick, I'll put those to you before we get to the end. But just quickly to run through, for some of you who might not be familiar, a little bit more about Global Government Forum and what we do. So if we go to the next slide, please, Raquel, thanks. This is essentially what we do. We are designed to amplify your organization's reach and to foster connections with public servants globally, regionally, or nationally. Thanks, Raquel. Next slide. Give you a sense of the types of things we do. Obviously, we do events like this one specifically. We do other kinds of webinars, which we'll come on to in a minute, but we do conferences. I'll tell you about a couple of those. We've got some couple of big conferences really coming up spring next year. We can do bespoke research. If there's areas that you want research done on, we can do that. We do training. I'll talk a little bit more about some specific training courses in a moment as well. Publishing, we obviously have the website. Please do look on there if you're not familiar with. There's loads of great content on there. And again, we can work with you on bespoke content as well. We do podcasts. We've got a great podcast series on leaders across the public sector, and also leaders from the private sector that work with the public sector as well. And we do, as we say, some of these types of online webinars and other events. Thanks, Raquel. Next slide. And just to say why GGF, why are we different? I mean, here are some of the things that we know we're highly trusted from the feedback that we get. We have that real expert insights. We have great people working with us, senior leaders from around the world, ex-public servants, but great people from the private sector as well. Completely impartial. And I think the very unique thing about us is our global reach. So we really do have a global network, which I think will be shown on the next slide as well. We move on to the next one. So here's our global reach. We have, you can see that I'm not going to go through it, but we have reach across the entire globe. So we have really good networks of civil servants and senior civil servants. I think that will be on the next slide as well. But we can basically reach civil servants and public servants in all areas of the world. And we do events around the world as well. We go from Singapore to Canada to Washington to the Caribbean. So we have events in all parts of the world. Next slide, please, Raquel. Thank you. And you can see on I think we will share these with everybody, so we can share these slides with everybody. Is that right, Richard? I can see you nodding. So you can see the types of people who are in our audience, the types of people that you would be able to engage with. So in particular, you might be interested in getting to certain professions. We break down events sometimes by professions. We have events for finance, we have events for digital leaders, but we also have 11% of our 11 and a bit % of our network are very senior civil servants and the decision makers as well. So in particular, if you're looking for particular people or policy areas or professions to engage with, we can certainly help with that here in GGF. Next slide, please, Raquel. Thank you. So just a couple of up and coming conferences to note. One in particular, we have our biggest annual event in the UK. It's called Innovation. We've been running this for several years. We get thousands of civil servants through the door. It's a really good opportunity for suppliers to meet senior civil servants from across the country. The next innovation is taking place in March 25th and 26th in London. If you do want to be involved in that, the contact details are there on the side, and you can see the quality of the speakers that we have there. They are just the list of speakers that we had from the UK, some of the speakers that we had, but we have senior experts flying in from around the world. So we had people coming in from America, from Singapore, from all over to speak at Innovation as well. So that's a real highlight of our conference calendar next year. Next slide, please, Raquel. And here's one, just an opportunity, if you are interested, there is a round table that we will be hosting on can new legislation solve government data sharing problems. I would say data is probably the issue that underlines all of the other events that we do, whether we're talking about AI or other new technologies. It always comes down to how good is the data and how well are you effectively are you sharing the data. I don't need to say that to a lot of the people who are probably watching this. That is very much the area of your expertise. If you are interested in being part of that roundtable or sponsoring that roundtable, then please do get in touch with Matt Hoare. Again, the contact details are there, but we will send you all of that. Thanks, Raquel. On to the next one. And then just to give you a sense, throughout the year, we run probably 1 or 2 webinars a week. We get great take up. These can be focused on a national audience or an international audience. They can be focused on specific professions or policy areas. Some of the topics that we have got planned for next year are listed there, everything from cybersecurity to digital credentials or digital IDs, you might know them as, tackling fraud and error, AI. But these are just our kind of work in progress at the moment. If you have specific topics you would like us to put on in terms of a webinar, again, we're very happy to discuss that with you. We do have quite a few webinars where we work with private sector partners on the content of those. So please, again, get in touch with us if you would like to be one of the part of one of those. And you can see our webinars all on demand on the website, so you can see the kind of thing that we do. Thanks, Raquel. And then moving on, I think, to training is probably the final area to cover. So again, we run all sorts of training programs, very well received training programs. They can be tailored. We can put on courses to suit your specific needs for you and your organization. I do want to highlight 2 ones that are coming up very soon. So there's one next Monday on the 25th, which is all about improving public sector productivity. It's called The Human Side of Mission-Driven Government. So very linked to what we've been talking about today. I think Raquel has just shared the details in the chat with all of you who are watching. But just to say, if you're interested in that one, you need to sign up by this Friday for that training one. And then Patrick, please do jump in if there's anything you want to add. But I understand you are leading a training event on the 28th of November, which is all about policy implementation and delivery, which again, I imagine will be set in the context of what we've been talking about today. That one's on the 28th of November, so that people still have a few days to sign up for that one. And then, of course, we also mentioned the procurement webinar, which I know will be of very high interest, I think, to people that are watching as well. So all the details of those we will send to you as well. And then finally, I think it's just the contact details, Raquel, yeah, there we go. But again, we will send you those. So anything that you are interested in then, but really, I would say there are fantastic opportunities to get alongside some of the new kind of senior officials in government to learn firsthand about what ministers are thinking and to really be part of this shaping the agenda as Labour are taking forward these missions through the events that we offer. Richard or Patrick, do you want to jump in on anything there? And to the audience, please do. Any questions you've got now? We've got about 10 minutes left, potentially, if you want to ask any other questions to Richard or Patrick or anything to us about how GGF work and how you might want to get involved.
I'll just jump in to mention that roundtable that you mentioned, Siobhan, can new legislation solve government data sharing problems, is planned for the 12th of December, which I was sure I'd put on that slide, but it was not there. So apologies for everyone. That's planned for the 12th of December. And that's probably worth just commenting on briefly. Obviously, a lot of this is about breaking down the mission approach is about breaking down silos in government and better joining up things. That requires, as a necessity, I think, breaking down the data silos that exist in government, and that I think a lot of people are frustrated by. As part of our research, the Digital Leaders 3 AI report of UK digital leaders that I mentioned, one of the comments that stuck with me from that was a very senior digital leader saying that there needs to be kind of enabling legislation to make it clear that this data can be shared, and that seems to be what this what a new piece of legislation, the Data Use and Access Bill that the government is putting through Parliament, will aim to do, to really clarify that how data can be shared across different parts of government. that to me seems a real opportunity for government to have the kind of insight and information that it needs to monitor these missions. But it is a long-standing problem in government, the sharing of data. So I'm very keen to explore in that roundtable kind of how this legislation can solve that problem, and if it is as much a cultural problem as a legal one as it often is, how can those hurdles be overcome, as well as passing new legislation. So I just want to flag that because I think it is very relevant to making the missions happen and monitoring that they're happening.
Thanks, Richard. I'm just saying there's a question here. If it feels like no one can say anything about anything without it turning into a partisan screaming match fueled by the media. This is coming from Sarah Honeybone. Does Labour have any innovative plans to improve public consultation processes and balance competing deeply held views on complex topics? I love that question because I think everything has become so kind of divisive. Patrick, you're nodding on this one. Any thoughts for Sarah on, I guess this is also a question about, has Labour got any plans just to improve the whole kind of way things are done, really?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it really touches on, a lot of the tensions around how our political culture works, which I have to say, I think mission-based government can do something to address, but it's not obviously not the whole answer. And I think, as Sarah rightly identifies, we're going to have to think more about, how we can engage more effectively with the public and with citizens. There is a lot in the mission-based approach that talks about the need to involve citizens much more directly in policy making and implementation. I think we haven't seen perhaps as much on that from the new government as we might have expected. So it'll be really worth keeping an eye in the next few months on whether we do see the government initiating perhaps some more proactive ways of thinking about how it can work with citizens on these key issues. But I don't think it's going to be easy for the government to get away from what's inferred in the question, which is this very adversarial political culture that we have in the UK. And I think that really is the tension around missions. Missions are about collaboration, they're about public engagement, they're about working differently, but they have to operate in an environment in which, in many ways, things have not changed at all. And there's still, that expectation on government to, to deliver in the ways that have been traditionally expected. I just want to finish by saying two other very quick things, Siobhan. One is that the delivery seminar, which I'm running, the training session in late November, is going to be very much focused on looking at how our approach to delivery has evolved in the last 20 years. So how with the ways in which we're rethinking how we set public sector targets, how we really get the right relationships in place between central government and public service providers. So if you're interested in that, I would really encourage people to come along. And then the other point I just wanted to make really quickly was just to emphasize, I think, the importance of colleagues on the call really keeping in touch with developments, and really, I think, being sensitized to the fact that a lot of what we're discussing today is going to be subject to very significant change over the next 2 years. I don't think anyone who's observed UK politics in the last decade or so could ignore the fact that instability has almost become baked into the way that our political system and system of government operates. And you can easily see how economic events, geopolitical events, the change of government in the United States, broader changes in the geopolitical landscape are going to impact on the government in the UK. And that will have lots of ramifications for how we work, for the ability of the government to deliver on its missions. So I would just emphasize the importance of just really keeping in touch with these developments and making sure that your organization is sensitized to the changes that are going on and the way that government will inevitably have to adapt to what will no doubt be some very big challenges ahead.
Yeah, fab. Thanks, Patrick. And one way to do that is hopefully through GGF, we're going to keep as topical as we can and make sure that the latest information is kept out there. Thanks. Richard, any closing thoughts from you?
Just want to touch on response to Sarah's question. I almost mentioned it earlier in the session, but the Labour manifesto makes big play of a kind of strategic partnership with business, and Patrick mentioned that there is an emphasis on that. So I think they will look to build a lot of partnerships between business and workers, alongside the workers' rights things, and try and create a more constructive dialogue that is kind of ongoing between a lot of different participants in society. I don't think Labour has gone towards any of the more innovative ideas around public consultation, like citizens' juries and things like that yet. And there is also a critique that I think some people in the Labour Party take to heart around the economic growth mission, that we are a nation that does too much consultation, not too little, and that there's things around building of houses, for example, where the effective impact of consultation is to slow building rather than to get to the best outcome. So there will also, I think, be places where Labour is looking to make the consultation process probably more effective, but definitely shorter. And that comes with kind of political risks as well. But as Patrick said, Labour will be judged in 5 years' time at the election on how much progress, headway it has made on these missions. It has tried to frame them as a decade-long pursuit, but I don't know to what extent voters will agree with that. And it's worth, I think, remembering that Labour has a very broad majority in the Parliament, but it's not very deep. There's a lot of more marginal constituencies now, and that all plays into consultation, how government can kind of listen to people, because it's going to have a political impact in the not too distant future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time. A great note to end on, because Ed, who sent in a couple of our questions, has said, thanks for today. Great session. And I couldn't agree more. So I just want to say thanks so much to Patrick and to Richard. And thanks to the audience, because you sent in great questions throughout. So I think that's exactly what we wanted, to have it as a conversation throughout. So thanks to Richard and to Patrick for answering the questions so fully and so honestly as well. To everybody who watched, I hope you really found it useful. As I said, we will send all of that information to you, so you'll have all of that in your inboxes as well. And hopefully we will see you at some of our future events and see you at some of our webinars and the conferences that are coming up. And please do send us your thoughts. This is the last one, I think. We're not planning any more, are we, at the moment, Richard, on how Whitehall works? We are doing some others going forward on the preparations for the new presidency in the US. But if you have any thoughts for particular webinars that would be of interest to you, please do let us know. And to Richard and to Patrick, you're getting lots of thanks in from people in the audience. So thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. And I look forward to see you again very soon at one of our other events. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Richard. Bye-bye for now.
You, everyone. Bye.